So we're talking the 4-day working week. It's had a huge amount of response and interest from around the world. But from your side of things, helping the company to implement this policy, what were some of the main issues that they had to watch out for when they were introducing this policy?
The main one sits at a conceptual level because our legislative framework for employees, the norms within that framework were being challenged. The norms of that framework are based around being paid for time spent or having set hours and things like a 5-day week. Those are the norms of our system, and this policy, this experiment really challenged those because it was looking at productivity and not looking at time spent but looking at productivity measures.
And so when you're working outside of that normal framework and looking at productivity, what issues does that raise? What do you need to be wary of, especially from a legalistic point of view?
So the starting point was to look at what are the minimum requirements in New Zealand, what do the laws say you have to provide for people, then what do the employment agreements provide, and making sure that the system wasn't going to cut across any of the rights and entitlements that are embedded both within the legal framework that's set by statute and then the legal framework set by the employment agreement.
So if we think about things like annual leave and sick leave, public holidays, how does all those types of measures that are based on a 40-hour week or being paid by the hour, how does that tie in when we're trying to condense 5 days a week into 4?
Great question. And again, it comes back to the focus on productivity and making sure that the deliverables are achieved within 4 days rather than 5. And the key thing of this system was to say that you're no longer thinking about being paid for 5 days and then being paid for 4 days. The pay stays the same. It's just the amount of work that you're going to do in terms of hours spent. That's what changes. But you need to move away from thinking about being paid for time spent to being paid for a deliverable. And the company's saying, we'll pay you for 5 days if you can deliver within 4. Now, that's challenging from a legislative perspective here because for example, our Holidays Act, the Holidays Act says that you are entitled to 4 weeks of paid leave per annum. What becomes a week when you're not working one of the days that you're being paid for? And that was one of the questions we had to look at.
And what was the answer to that particular question?
Well, the answer from the Holidays Act's perspective for this system that the company's put in place is that the week doesn't change because you're being still paid for 5 days. So if I then take 5 days of leave, a week's leave, that is still being paid for 5 days. So my 1 week's leave, even though I would only work for 4 days in that week, I will still be paid for 5.
As a general rule, that would seem to suggest that it might be easier to introduce this policy than you might expect, because really nothing too much changes from the existing or the traditional setup.
Look, that's correct. And one of the big questions that the company looked at was whether or not what a week is for the purposes of annual leave would change. And they've adopted a system where it doesn't change. And that's how we've managed to make the system work within the current legislative framework.
All right, now let's go back to that interest we're seeing from around the world. What practical pieces of advice would you have for companies that are thinking of undertaking a similar measure, but are concerned about their liability or otherwise when it comes to the workers and the amount of time they're owed, and especially when it comes to holidays and things like that?
It's like any employment change in a workplace. You need to look at your employment agreements. So what are you obliged to provide? You need to look at the legislation. What does the law say you have to provide under legislation? And then when you know what those two elements are, it's then making sure you've got good communication and consultation with your staff around the system. And the company did that really well. It was very much an employee-driven ideas process, getting their feedback. And the New Zealand landscape is heavily focused on employee consultation. Our legislative landscape has got good faith at the centre of it, and good faith requires consultation. And so that element really allowed the company to get the best out of the staff's ideas. But the key tip is get advice early to make sure that you can design your system in a way that's going to be compliant with your obligations, both under statute and your employment agreements, whatever jurisdiction you're in.
And any pitfalls employers should be wary of, thinking ahead that they might be concerned that an employee might base this changed work week scenario for their benefit and against the employer. Any pitfalls an employer should be wary of?
I think the main thing goes back to what I was talking about around consultation, because if you set the right platform for it, expectations are understood and everyone's on the same page. And so we had a lot of conversation around making sure employees understood that this was a policy, it was a scheme, but it was all based around productivity and focused on the company's values. And so if you ensure that people are aligned to both the productivity measures and the company values, the right behaviours should come through.
By all accounts, it was a great success. It really came through and worked pretty smoothly. You were obviously working very closely with the company. Were you surprised at how smoothly it worked? And
I was really pleased to see how well it worked. And I think for New Zealand, these efforts that are being made to look at different ways of working are so important. Because when I think about the future of work and I think about things like the gig economy, we have already got different systems that are challenging the norms of our legislative landscape. And this was really great to see a business being able to create a different system focused on productivity, focused around getting the best for their people and from their people. I was really pleased to see that work well and pleased to see it embraced, because I think we need more businesses challenging those norms as platforms, gig platforms start to challenge our legislative norms.
Some companies might be a little bit resistant to anything that goes against the status quo, worried about legal issues. There could be some resistance there, but you'd encourage, you'd recommend employers looking into this at least?
Horses for courses. I would say that it will not fit every business. And indeed, for this business, it's not fitting every part of the business. But there will be particular areas which I think can embrace these changes to get better productivity from their staff and allow them the extra that they get back, which is that day where they can just take care of what they want to take care of in their day, but without compromising what they're earning, which is fantastic.
You talk there about the sort of positive side, the opportunities. Any challenges or threats that employers should be wary of?
I think the main thing is making sure that they have a system which can flex. We're in a time of disruption, we're in a time of change, and so I think being able to be nimble and being able to flex is important, and that was certainly something on the minds when we were being asked to look at this particular structure. How could we ensure that it wasn't going to tie the business to something that actually could be detrimental in the longer term? So flexibility is really important.
Are there any other issues when it comes to things like annual leave that employers do need to be mindful of?
For New Zealand, certainly, the Holidays Act in New Zealand is under review. The government's announced a working group that's going to look at how the Holidays Act works in practice, because there's been many employers struggling with the concepts within the legislation as work practices become more variable, because the current framework is built around those norms of standard weeks and standard hours. So as part of the working group on this project, the company has given feedback to the government's Holidays Act working group on the findings of this project and the challenges that we had to address as part of making this system work within the current legislative environment. We were keen to ensure that the learnings from this project could be fed into that working group, because as that working group thinks about a Holidays Act for the future, it's important that the working group is aware of the issues that the current framework had to grapple with. And hopefully we can then feed into building a system that is easier for employers to follow.
So that's interesting. So this project, this experiment's already feeding back possibly into government policy.
That's right, yes, and we were part of making a submission to government, to the working group on that.